The town of Willowbrook was the kind of place where secrets festered beneath the surface of polite smiles and neighborly waves. Nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forests, it was a place where the air always seemed heavier, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The streets were lined with quaint houses, their white picket fences and blooming gardens masking the quiet desperation that lived within. It was a town where everyone knew everyone, yet no one truly knew anything at all. At the heart of Willowbrook stood a modest two-story house, its paint chipped and its garden overgrown. This was the home of 16-year-old Emily Carter, a girl whose life had been anything but ordinary. Emily was the kind of girl who faded into the background, her presence as quiet as the rustle of leaves in the wind. She had long, chestnut-brown hair that she often tied back in a loose braid, and her hazel eyes held a depth that seemed far beyond her years. She was a dreamer, a writer, and a survivor, though she didn't yet know the full extent of what she was surviving. Emily's mother, Linda Carter, was a woman who had once been full of life. She had been a vibrant, ambitious woman with dreams of becoming a singer, but life had a way of grinding those dreams into dust. Now, Linda was a shadow of her former self, her once bright eyes dulled by years of disappointment and hardship. She worked long hours at a diner on the edge of town, her hands calloused and her spirit broken. Linda had always been a complicated figure in Emily's life, a mother who loved her daughter in her own way, but was often too consumed by her own struggles to show it. Then there was Robert, Linda's second husband and Emily's stepfather. Robert was a man who carried himself with an air of authority, his broad shoulders and stern expression commanding respect or fear. He had come into their lives when Emily was just 10 years old, a charming and seemingly kind man who had swept Linda off her feet. But over time, the charm had faded, revealing a man who was controlling, manipulative, and deeply insecure. Robert worked as a mechanic, though his income was never enough to lift the family out of their financial struggles. He was a man who believed the world owed him something, and he was determined to collect, no matter the cost. The Carters' home was a place where tension hung thick in the air, a place where whispered arguments and stifled sobs were the soundtrack of Emily's life. Money was always tight, and the stress of their financial situation weighed heavily on Linda and Robert's marriage. Emily had learned to navigate the minefield of their home with quiet precision, avoiding conflict whenever possible and retreating into the sanctuary of her books and journals. But even she couldn't escape the growing sense that something was deeply wrong. It was on a cold, gray afternoon in late October that everything changed. Emily had come home from school to find her mother sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and her hands trembling. Robert was pacing the room, his jaw clenched and his eyes dark with anger. The air was thick with tension, and Emily could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest. "We need to talk," Linda said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes were red-rimmed, as if she had been crying, and there was a fragility in her tone that made Emily's stomach twist. Emily sat down at the table, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at Robert, who was now standing in the corner of the room, his arms crossed over his chest. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that sent a chill down her spine. "We're in trouble," Linda began, her voice shaking. "The bills are piling up, and we're behind on the mortgage. If we don't do something soon, we're going to lose the house." Emily's mind raced as she tried to process her mother's words. She had known things were bad, but she hadn't realized just how dire their situation had become. She looked at her mother, searching for some sign of hope, but all she saw was despair. "What are we going to do?" Emily asked, her voice barely audible. Linda hesitated, her eyes flickering to Robert before returning to Emily. There's a way," she said slowly, her words heavy with meaning. "But it's not going to be easy." Emily's heart sank as she waited for her mother to continue. She had a sinking feeling that whatever was coming next would change everything. "Robert has a friend," Linda said, her voice trembling. "Someone who's willing to help us. But there's a condition." Emily's stomach churned as she looked from her mother to Robert, who was now staring at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She didn't want to ask, but she knew she had to. "What kind of condition?" she whispered. Linda took a deep breath, her hands clutching the edge of the table, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. He wants you to spend the night with him." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and for a moment, Emily couldn't breathe. She felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under her, leaving her suspended in a void of disbelief and horror. She looked at her mother, searching for some sign that this was a cruel joke, but all she saw was guilt and desperation. "Mom, you can't be serious," Emily said, her voice breaking. "You can't ask me to do this." Linda's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to take Emily's hand, but Emily pulled away. "I don't want to," Linda said, her voice choked with emotion. "But we don't have a choice. If we don't do this, we'll lose everything." Emily felt as if the walls were closing in around her, the weight of her mother's words crushing her. She looked at Robert, who was still standing in the corner, his expression unreadable. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of something dark and dangerous, that made her blood run cold. "Please," Linda begged, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do this for us. For me." Emily's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Fear, anger, betrayal. She wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit there and listen to her mother's plea. But deep down, she knew that there was no escape. She was trapped, caught in a web of desperation and manipulation that she couldn't break free from. And so, with a heavy heart and a sense of dread that she couldn't shake, Emily nodded. It was a decision that would change her life forever, a decision that would force her to confront the darkest corners of her own strength and resilience. But for now, all she could do was sit there, her hands trembling and her heart breaking, as the weight of her mother's words settled over her like a shroud. Emily's room had always been her sanctuary. It was a small space, tucked under the eave of the house, with a slanted ceiling and a single window that overlooked the backyard. The walls were lined with bookshelves, each one crammed with novels, journals, and trinkets she collected over the years. A worn-out armchair sat in the corner, its fabric frayed but still comfortable, and a desk by the window held her most prized possession, a typewriter she had saved up for over 2 years to buy. It was here, in this little corner of the world, that Emily felt most like herself. But tonight, her sanctuary felt like a prison. She sat on the edge of her bed, her knees pulled up to her chest and her arms wrapped tightly around them. The house was silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy and oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Downstairs, she could hear the faint murmur of her mother and Robert talking, their voices low and urgent. Emily didn't want to know what they were saying. She didn't want to think about what was coming. Her mind kept replaying the conversation from earlier, the words echoing in her head like a broken record. "He wants you to spend the night with him." How could her mother ask that of her? How could she even consider it? Emily felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, but it was quickly drowned out by a wave of helplessness. She had always known that her mother was desperate, but this was something else entirely. Emily's thoughts turned to Robert, and a shiver ran down her spine. She had never liked him, not really. He had always been cold and distant, his presence in their home more like a shadow than a person. But lately, there had been something different about him, something darker. She had caught him watching her sometimes, his gaze lingering a little too long, his expression unreadable. It had made her skin crawl, but she had told herself she was imagining things. Now, she wasn't so sure. The sound of footsteps on the stairs pulled Emily from her thoughts, and she tensed, her heart pounding in her chest. A moment later, there was a soft knock on her door. "Emily?" It was her mother's voice, hesitant and trembling. Emily didn't respond. She didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to scream, to demand answers, to make her mother see how wrong this was. But another part of her, the part that had always tried to be the good daughter, the part that didn't want to make things harder, kept her silent. The door creaked open and Linda stepped inside. She looked older than she had just a few hours ago, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She hesitated for a moment, then crossed the room and sat down on the edge of the bed beside Emily. "I'm so sorry," Linda whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted this for you. You have to believe me." Emily turned to look at her mother, her heart aching at the sight of the woman who had once been her hero. Linda had always been strong, resilient, the kind of person who could weather any storm. But now, she looked broken, her shoulders slumped and her hands trembling in her lap. "Then why are you doing this?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How can you ask me to do something like this?" Linda's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to take Emily's hand. But Emily pulled away. "I don't have a choice," Linda said, her voice choked with emotion. "If we don't do this, we'll lose everything. The house, the car, everything we've worked for. I can't let that happen." "And what about me?" Emily demanded, her voice rising. "What about what I want? What about what's right?" Linda flinched, as if the words had physically struck her. "I know it's not fair," she said, her voice trembling. "But sometimes life isn't fair. Sometimes we have to make sacrifices for people we love." Emily stared at her mother, her heart breaking at the words. She wanted to believe that Linda was doing this because she had no other choice. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. That maybe, just maybe, her mother was using her as a way to escape her own guilt, her own failures. "I can't do this," Emily said, her voice shaking. "I can't." Linda's face crumpled, and she reached out to pull Emily into a hug. Emily stiffened at first, but then she melted into her mother's embrace, the familiar scent of her perfume bringing a flood of memories, of happier times, of laughter and love. But even as she clung to her mother, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been irreparably broken between them. "You're stronger than you think," Linda whispered, her voice barely audible. "You'll get through this. We'll get through this." Emily wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe that this was just a dark chapter in their lives, one that they would eventually move past. But as she sat there, her mother's arms around her and the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders, she couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning. The next morning, Emily woke to the sound of voices downstairs. She lay in bed for a moment, staring up at the ceiling, her mind still foggy with sleep. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back, and she felt a surge of panic. She got up quickly, her heart pounding, and crossed the room to her window. The backyard was bathed in the soft light of dawn, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. It was a peaceful scene, one that felt at odds with the turmoil inside her. Downstairs, the voices grew louder, and Emily recognized Robert's tone, sharp and impatient. She hesitated for a moment, then crept out of her room and down the stairs, her footsteps silent on the creaky wooden steps. She paused at the bottom of the stairs, her heart racing as she listened to the conversation in the kitchen. "We don't have time for this," Robert was saying, his voice low and angry. "If she doesn't do it, we're done. We'll lose everything." "I know," Linda replied, her voice trembling. "But she's just a kid, Robert. This isn't fair to her." "Life isn't fair," Robert snapped. "You think I want to do this? You think I like the idea of some creep putting his hands on her? But we don't have a choice. If we don't do this, we're finished." Emily's stomach churned at the words, and she felt a surge of anger. How could they talk about her like this, as if she were nothing more than a pawn in their game? She wanted to storm into the kitchen, to demand that they stop, but she couldn't move. She was frozen in place, her heart pounding and her mind racing. "She'll do it," Linda said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "She has to." Emily felt a surge of betrayal at the words, and she turned and ran back up the stairs, her vision blurred with tears. She didn't stop until she was back in her room, the door closed tightly behind her. She sank down onto the bed, her hands trembling and her heart breaking. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to fight this. All she knew was that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even begin to imagine, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The days that followed the initial conversation were a blur for Emily. She moved through them like a ghost, her mind numb and her body on autopilot. She went to school, sat through classes, and came home, but none of it felt real. It was as if she were watching her life from a distance, disconnected from the world around her. Her mother tried to talk to her, to explain, to apologize, but Emily couldn't bring herself to respond. Every time Linda approached her, Emily would shut down, retreating into herself like a turtle pulling into its shell. She couldn't bear to look at her mother, couldn't bear to hear the excuses and justifications. The betrayal was too fresh, too raw. Robert, on the other hand, seemed to grow more impatient with each passing day. He would watch Emily with a cold, calculating gaze, his presence looming over her like a storm cloud. He didn't say much, but his silence was more menacing than any words could have been. Emily could feel the tension building, the pressure mounting, and she knew it was only a matter of time before something snapped. That time came on a Friday evening, just over a week after the initial conversation. Emily was in her room, sitting at her desk and staring blankly at the typewriter in front of her. She hadn't been able to write since that day. The words that had once flowed so easily now stuck in her throat. She was just about to give up and go to bed when there was a knock on her door. "Emily?" It was Robert's voice, low and gruff. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't respond, hoping he would go away. But the door creaked open and Robert stepped inside. He was dressed in his usual work clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt. But there was something different about him tonight. Something in his eyes made Emily's skin crawl. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Emily nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She stood up slowly, her legs trembling beneath her, and followed Robert out of the room. He led her downstairs to the living room, where Linda was sitting on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up as Emily entered, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and desperation. "Sit down," Robert said, gesturing to the armchair across from the couch. Emily obeyed, sinking into the chair and folding her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. She glanced at her mother, but Linda quickly looked away, her face pale and drawn. "We've made arrangements," Robert said, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. "Tomorrow night, you'll go to his house. He'll pick you up at 8. Emily felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. She had known this was coming, had known it was inevitable, but hearing it out loud made it feel all too real. She looked at her mother, hoping for some sign of protest, some sign that Linda would put a stop to this, but Linda just sat there, her eyes downcast and her hands trembling. "I can't," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "You don't have a choice," Robert said, his tone sharp and final. "This is happening, whether you like it or not, so you better get used to the idea." Emily felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, but it was quickly drowned out by a wave of helplessness. She wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything but sit there and listen to Robert's cold, detached words. But she knew it wouldn't make a difference. She was trapped, caught in a web of desperation and manipulation that she couldn't break free from. The next day passed in a haze. Emily went through the motions of her usual routine, but her mind was elsewhere, consumed by the dread of what was to come. She tried to distract herself with schoolwork, with books, with anything that could take her mind off the impending night. But nothing worked. The hours dragged on, each one bringing her closer to the moment she had been dreading. By the time 8 o'clock rolled around, Emily was a nervous wreck. She sat on the edge of her bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her heart pounding in her chest. She had changed into the dress her mother had laid out for her, a simple, modest thing that felt like a betrayal in itself. And now she waited, her stomach churning with anxiety. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway made her jump, and she felt a surge of panic. She wanted to run, to hide, to do anything but face what was coming. But she knew it was pointless. There was no escape. A moment later, there was a knock on the front door, and Emily heard Robert's heavy footsteps as he went to answer it. She couldn't hear the conversation that followed, but a few minutes later, Robert appeared in her doorway. "He's here," he said, his tone cold and detached. "Let's go." Emily stood up slowly, her legs trembling beneath her, and followed Robert downstairs. The man waiting in the living room was exactly as she had imagined, middle-aged, with a receding hairline and a paunch that strained against his button-up shirt. He smiled when he saw her, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile that made Emily's skin crawl. "Emily, this is Mr. Grayson," Robert said, his tone formal and businesslike. "He's the one who's going to help us." Emily nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She glanced at her mother, who was standing in the corner of the room, her face pale and her hands trembling. Linda looked as if she wanted to say something, to stop this, but she remained silent, her eyes downcast. "Well, shall we go?" Mr. Grayson asked, his tone overly cheerful. Emily nodded again, her heart pounding in her chest. She followed him out to his car, a sleek black sedan that looked out of place in their modest driveway. He opened the passenger door for her, and she slid inside, her hands trembling as she fastened her seatbelt. The drive to Mr. Grayson's house was a blur. Emily stared out the window, her mind numb and her body on autopilot. She barely registered the passing scenery, the streetlights and houses and trees all blending together into a meaningless haze. She felt as if she were floating, disconnected from the world around her. When they finally arrived at Mr. Grayson's house, Emily felt a surge of panic. It was a large, imposing structure with manicured lawn and a long, winding driveway. It looked like something out of a magazine, but to Emily, it felt like a prison. Mr. Grayson led her inside, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. The interior of the house was just as imposing as the exterior, with high ceilings and expensive-looking furniture. Emily fell out of place, like a stray cat that had wandered into a museum. "Make yourself comfortable," Mr. Grayson said, his tone overly cheerful. "Can I get you something to drink?" Emily shook her head, her throat too tight to speak. She sat down on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her heart pounding in her chest. Mr. Grayson sat down beside her, his presence overwhelming. He reached out to touch her hand, and Emily flinched, pulling away instinctively. "Relax," he said, his tone soothing but with an edge of impatience. "There's no need to be nervous." Emily nodded, but she couldn't relax. She felt as if she were suffocating, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. She wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but sit there and endure what was coming. But she knew there was no escape. The days after Emily's night with Mr. Grayson were a blur of numbness and dread. She moved through them like a shadow, her mind detached from her body, her emotions buried beneath a thick layer of shock. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply existed, going through the motions of her daily life while her soul felt like it had been hollowed out. At school, she became even more withdrawn, avoiding her classmates and teachers alike. She stopped participating in class, stopped turning in assignments, stopped caring. Her best friend, Sarah, noticed a change immediately. Sarah had always been the outgoing one, the one who could pull Emily out of her shell with a well-timed joke or a shared secret. But now, even Sarah's efforts fell flat. "Emily, what's going on?" Sarah asked one afternoon, cornering her in the hallway after school. "You've been acting weird for weeks. Did something happen?" Emily shook her head, avoiding Sarah's gaze. "I'm fine," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. "You're not fine," Sarah insisted, her tone softening. "You can talk to me, you know. Whatever it is, I'm here for you." For a moment, Emily considered telling her. She imagined the words spilling out, the weight of her secret lifted, if only for a moment. But then she thought of her mother, of Robert, of the consequences of speaking out, and the words died on her lips. "I'm just tired," Emily said finally, forcing a weak smile. "I'll be okay." Sarah didn't look convinced, but she didn't push further. Instead, she gave Emily a tight hug, one that Emily couldn't bring herself to return. As Sarah walked away, Emily felt a pang of guilt. She hated lying to her friend, but what choice did she have? The truth was too dangerous, too ugly to share. At home, the tension was palpable. Linda tried to act as if nothing had happened, as if their lives were still normal, but the cracks in her facade were impossible to ignore. She would hover around Emily, offering her food or asking about her day, but her eyes were haunted, her hands trembling as she spoke. It was as if she were trying to make up for what she had done. But Emily couldn't bring herself to forgive her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Robert, on the other hand, seemed more emboldened than ever. He strutted around the house like a man who had won a great victory, his cold, calculating gaze always lingering on Emily a little too long. He didn't say much, but his silence was more menacing than any words could have been. Emily could feel the weight of his expectations, the unspoken demand that she play her part in their twisted arrangement. One evening, as Emily was washing the dishes after dinner, Robert approached her. He leaned against the counter, his arms crossed over his chest, and watched her with that same unnerving intensity. "You did good," he said finally, his voice low and gruff. Mr. Grayson was pleased. Emily froze, her hands gripping the edge of the sink, so tightly her knuckles turned white. She couldn't respond. The words felt like a slap, a reminder of what she had been forced to do. "He's willing to help us out again," Robert continued, his tone casual, as if they were discussing the weather. "But he wants to see you one more time. Next week." Emily's stomach churned, and she felt a surge of panic. She wanted to scream, to refuse, to do anything but agree, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. Robert wasn't asking for her consent. He was telling her what was going to happen. "I can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. Robert's expression darkened, and he took a step closer, his presence looming over her like a storm cloud. "You don't have a choice," he said, his tone sharp and final. "This is what's best for the family. You'll do as you're told." Emily felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, but it was quickly drowned out by a wave of helplessness. She wanted to fight back, to stand up for herself, but she knew it was pointless. Robert held all the power, and she was just a pawn in his game. As the days passed, Emily began to notice subtle changes in her mother. Linda, who had always been so strong and resilient, seemed to be unraveling. She would spend hours locked in her room, crying softly or pacing the house like a caged animal. She stopped going to work, claiming she was sick, but Emily knew the truth. The guilt was eating her alive. One night, Emily overheard her parents arguing. She had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when the sound of raised voices pulled her from her thoughts. She crept out of her room and down the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. "I can't do this anymore," Linda was saying, her voice trembling with emotion. "This isn't right, Robert. She's just a kid. She's old enough to understand what's at stake." Robert shot back, his tone cold and detached. "We're in this mess because of you. If you hadn't been so careless with the money, we wouldn't be in this situation." "That's not fair," Linda protested, her voice breaking. "I never wanted this. I never wanted any of this." "Well, it's too late now," Robert said, his tone final. "We're in too deep. You want to back out now, you'll lose everything. Is that what you want?" Linda didn't respond, but Emily could hear the soft sound of her crying. She felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, but it was quickly drowned out by a wave of helplessness. She wanted to storm into the room, to demand that they stop, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. The damage was already done. Meanwhile, a new subplot began to emerge at school. Emily's English teacher, Mrs. Thompson, had noticed her son decline in participation and grades. Mrs. Thompson was a kind, empathetic woman who had always taken a special interest in Emily's writing. One afternoon, she asked Emily to stay after class. "Emily, I've noticed you've been struggling lately," Mrs. Thompson said gently, her eyes filled with concern. "Is everything okay at home?" Emily hesitated, her mind racing. She wanted to tell the truth, to confide in someone who might actually be able to help her. But the fear of what Robert might do, of what her mother might lose, kept her silent. "I'm fine," Emily said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've just been tired." Mrs. Thompson didn't look convinced, but she didn't push further. Instead, she handed Emily a book, a collection of poetry by Maya Angelou. "Sometimes it helps to know you're not alone," she said softly. "If you ever need to talk, I'm here." Emily took the book, her hands trembling, and nodded. She wanted to believe that Mrs. Thompson could help her, but the weight of her secret felt too heavy to share. As the days passed, Emily began to feel more and more isolated. She was trapped in a web of lies and manipulation with no way out. The only solace she found was in her writing. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the world felt far away, she would sit at her desk and pour her heart out onto the page. It was the only way she could make sense of the chaos in her life, the only way she could hold on to a shred of herself. But even that small comfort was threatened when Robert discovered her journal. One evening, as Emily was getting ready for bed, she heard a knock on her door. Before she could respond, Robert pushed it open, her journal in his hand. "What's this?" he asked, his tone cold and accusing. Emily's heart sank, and she felt a surge of panic. "It's just my journal," she stammered, her voice trembling. Robert flipped through the pages, his expression darkening as he read. "You think writing about this is going to help?" he demanded, his voice rising. "You think anyone's going to care?" Emily didn't respond, her mind racing. She wanted to snatch the journal back, to protect the one thing that was still hers. But she knew it was pointless. Robert held all the power, and she was just a pawn in his game. "You're going to stop this," Robert said, his tone final. "No more writing. No more secrets. You'll do as you're told, or there will be consequences." Emily nodded, her heart breaking as she watched Robert toss the journal into the trash. She felt as if a part of herself had been ripped away, leaving her even more hollow than before. The air in the Carter household grew heavier with each passing day, thick with unspoken words and unresolved tension. Emily felt like a stranger in her own home, her every move watched, her every breath scrutinized. Robert's control over her life tightened like a noose, and Linda's guilt-ridden silence only made things worse. Emily's journal, once her only outlet, was gone, and with it, a piece of her soul. She felt hollow, like a shell of the person she used to be. But even in the darkest moments, a spark of defiance began to flicker within her. It was small at first, barely noticeable, but it grew stronger with each passing day. Emily was tired of being a pawn in Robert's game, tired of carrying the weight of her mother's mistakes. She didn't know how to fight back, but she knew she had to try. One evening, as Emily sat at the dinner table pushing food around her plate, Robert dropped a bombshell. "Mr. Grayson wants to see you again," he said, his tone casual, as if he were discussing the weather. "This Friday." Emily froze, her fork slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the plate. She looked up at Robert, her heart pounding in her chest. "No," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm not doing it." Robert's expression darkened, and he set his glass down with a sharp thud. "You don't have a choice," he said, his tone cold and final. "This is what's best for the family." "Best for the family?" Emily repeated, her voice rising. "How is this best for anyone? How can you even ask me to do this?" Robert stood up, his chair scraping against the floor, and leaned across the table, his face inches from Emily's. "You'll do as you're told," he said, his voice low and menacing, "or you'll regret it." Emily felt a surge of fear, but for the first time it was accompanied by something else. Anger. Hot, searing anger that burned through the numbness and fear. She stood up, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "No," she said again, louder this time. "I won't do it." Robert's hand shot out, grabbing her arm in a vice-like grip. "You ungrateful little," he began, but before he could finish, Linda intervened. "Robert, stop." Linda cried, her voice trembling but firm. She stood up, her face pale but determined. "Let her go." Robert turned to Linda, his expression a mixture of surprise and fury. "Stay out of this," he snapped. "This is your fault. If you hadn't been so careless with the money, we wouldn't be in this mess." Linda flinched, but she didn't back down. "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "I know this is my fault, but I can't let you do this anymore. I can't let you destroy her." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Then Robert released Emily's arm and took a step back, his expression unreadable. "Fine," he said, his tone cold and detached. "But don't come crying to me when we lose everything." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Emily and Linda standing in stunned silence. Emily looked at her mother, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time in weeks, she saw a glimmer of the woman Linda used to be, strong, resilient, and willing to fight for what was right. "Mom," Emily began, her voice trembling. Linda shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Emily," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for everything." Emily didn't know what to say. She wanted to forgive her mother, to believe that things could change, but the wounds were still too fresh, the pain too deep. Instead, she simply nodded and walked out of the room, her mind racing. The next day at school, Emily found herself unable to focus. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the confrontation with Robert, to the look on her mother's face when she finally stood up for her. It was a small victory, but it gave Emily hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. After school, Sarah cornered her again. "Emily, you got to talk to me," she said, her tone pleading. "I can't help you if I don't know what's going on." Emily hesitated, her mind racing. She wanted to tell Sarah the truth, to confide in someone who might actually be able to help her. But the fear of what Robert might do, of what her mother might lose, kept her silent. "I can't," Emily said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just can't." Sarah looked hurt, but she didn't push further. Instead, she handed Emily a folded piece of paper. "If you change your mind, call me," she said softly. "I'm here for you, no matter what." Emily took the paper, her hands trembling, and nodded. She wanted to believe that Sarah could help her, but the weight of her secret felt too heavy to share. That evening, Emily found herself alone in the house. Linda had gone to work, and Robert was out running errands. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of freedom, however fleeting. She sat down at her desk and pulled out a blank sheet of paper, her hands trembling as she began to write. The words poured out of her, raw and unfiltered, a flood of emotions she'd been holding back for weeks. She wrote about the fear, the anger, the betrayal. She wrote about the night with Mr. Grayson, about the weight of her mother's guilt, about the suffocating control Robert held over their lives. She wrote until her hand cramped and her vision blurred with tears. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. When she was finally done, she folded the paper and tucked it into her backpack, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what she was going to do with it, but she knew she couldn't keep it to herself. The truth was too heavy to carry alone. The next day, Emily went to see Mrs. Thompson. She waited until after school, when the halls were empty, and knocked on the door of her classroom. "Emily," Mrs. Thompson said, her tone warm but concerned. "What can I do for you?" Emily hesitated, her hands trembling as she pulled the folded paper from her backpack. I need your help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Thompson took the paper and unfolded it, her expression growing more serious as she read. When she was done, she looked up at Emily, her eyes filled with compassion and determination. "Thank you for trusting me with this," she said softly. "You're not alone, Emily. We'll get through this together." Emily felt a surge of relief, but it was quickly followed by fear. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. Her life was about to change forever. The days following Emily's decision to confide in Mrs. Thompson were a whirlwind of fear, hope, and uncertainty. She had handed over her written account of the abuse, the manipulation, and the unbearable weight of her family's secrets, but she had no idea what would happen next. Mrs. Thompson had assured her that she would take action, that she would help. But Emily couldn't shake the gnawing fear that Robert would find out before anything could be done. At home, the tension was unbearable. Robert's anger simmered just beneath the surface, his cold, calculating gaze always lingering on Emily a little too long. He hadn't mentioned the confrontation at dinner again. But Emily could feel the storm brewing, the pressure building with each passing day. She tried to stay out of his way, to avoid giving him any reason to lash out, but she knew it was only a matter of time before something snapped. Linda, too, seemed to sense the impending storm. She had been quieter than usual, her guilt-ridden silence replaced by a nervous energy that made her fidget and pace. She tried to talk to Emily a few times, to apologize, to explain, but Emily couldn't bring herself to respond. The wounds were still too fresh, the betrayal too deep. One evening, as Emily was sitting in her room trying to focus on her homework, she heard raised voices downstairs. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest, and crept to the top of the stairs to listen. "You think I don't know what you're up to?" Robert's voice was low and menacing, his tone sending a chill down Emily's spine. "You think I don't see the way you've been sneaking around, whispering behind my back?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Linda replied, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm just trying to keep this family together." "Keep this family together?" Robert repeated, his voice rising. "You're the one who tore it apart. If you hadn't been so careless with the money, we wouldn't be in this mess." Emily's stomach churned at the words, and she felt a surge of anger. She wanted to storm downstairs to defend her mother, but she knew it would only make things worse. Instead, she stayed where she was, her hands clenched into fists, her heart pounding in her chest. "I know I made mistakes," Linda said, her voice breaking. "But I can't let you destroy her. I can't let you destroy us." There was a moment of silence, and then Robert's voice, cold and detached, cut through the air like a knife. "You're too late. She's already gone." Emily felt a surge of panic at the words, and she crept back to her room, her mind racing. What did he mean? Did he know about Mrs. Thompson? Did he know about the letter? She didn't know what to do, but she knew she had to be ready for whatever came next. The next day at school, Emily found herself unable to focus. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the confrontation between her mother and Robert, to the cold, detached tone of his voice. She felt like she was walking on a tightrope, one wrong move away from falling into the abyss. After school, Mrs. Thompson asked Emily to stay behind. "I've spoken to the principal," she said, her tone gentle but serious. "We're going to involve Child Protective Services. They'll need to talk to you, but I'll be there every step of the way." Emily nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had known this was coming, but hearing out loud made it feel all too real. "What about my mom?" she asked, her voice trembling. "They'll want to talk to her too," Mrs. Thompson said. "But you don't have to worry about that. Just focus on telling the truth." Emily nodded again, but the fear in her chest was overwhelming. She didn't know what would happen to her mother, to Robert, to their family. All she knew was that her life was about to change forever. That evening, Emily came home to find Robert waiting for her in the living room. He was sitting in his usual chair, his expression cold and unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made Emily's blood run cold. "Sit down," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Emily obeyed, sinking into the armchair across from him, her hands trembling in her lap. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew it wasn't good. "I know what you've been up to," Robert said, his voice low and menacing. "I know you've been talking to your teacher, spreading lies about me." Emily's heart sank, and she felt a surge of panic. How did he know? Had someone told him? Or had he just figured out on his own? "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice trembling. Robert leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Don't play dumb with me," he said, his tone sharp and final. "I know everything, and if you think you can ruin me, you're dead wrong." Emily felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, but it was quickly drowned out by a wave of helplessness. She wanted to fight back, to stand up for herself, but she knew it was pointless. Robert held all the power, and she was just a pawn in his game. "You're going to stop this," Robert said, his tone final. "You're going to tell your teacher it was all a lie, or there will be consequences." Emily didn't respond, her mind racing. She didn't know what to do, but she knew she couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything. The next day, Emily went to school with a heavy heart. She knew what she had to do, but the fear of what Robert might do, of what her mother might lose, kept her silent. She wanted to talk to Mrs. Thompson, to tell her the truth, but the words stuck in her throat. After school, Mrs. Thompson asked Emily to stay behind again. "The social worker is coming tomorrow," she said, her tone gentle but serious. "Are you ready?" Emily hesitated, her mind racing. She wanted to say yes, to believe that things could change, but the fear was overwhelming. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice trembling. Mrs. Thompson reached out and took Emily's hand, her expression filled with compassion. "You're not alone," she said softly. "We'll get through this together." Emily nodded, but the fear in her chest was overwhelming. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. Her life was about to change forever. The day of the meeting with the social worker arrived, and Emily felt like she was walking through a nightmare. Her stomach churned with anxiety, her hands trembled, and her mind raced with 1,000 what-ifs. She had barely slept the night before, her thoughts consumed by the fear of what Robert might do if he found out. But she also knew there was no turning back. She had to see this through, no matter the cost. Mrs. Thompson met her at the school entrance, her expression calm, but determined. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. Emily nodded, though her heart was pounding in her chest. She didn't feel ready, but she knew she had no choice. "What's going to happen?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The social worker will talk to you first," Mrs. Thompson explained. "She'll ask you questions about what's been happening at home. Just tell her the truth. I'll be there with you the whole time." Emily nodded again, her throat too tight to speak. She followed Mrs. Thompson to a small office in the administrative wing of the school, where a woman in her late 30s with kind eyes and a warm smile was waiting for them. "Emily, this is Miss Carter," Mrs. Thompson said, introducing the social worker. "She's here to help." Ms. Carter extended her hand, and Emily shook it, her grip weak and trembling. "It's nice to meet you, Emily," Ms. Carter said, her tone gentle. "I know this is hard, but I'm here to listen. Whatever you tell me, I'll do my best to help." Emily sat down in the chair across from Ms. Carter, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Mrs. Thompson sat beside her, a reassuring presence that gave Emily the courage to begin. At first, the words came slowly, haltingly, as if each one had to fight his way past the lump in her throat. But as she spoke, the floodgates opened and the story poured out of her. The abuse, the manipulation, the unbearable weight of her family's secrets. She told Miss Carter about the night with Mr. Grayson, about Robert's threats, about her mother's guilt-ridden silence. She told her everything, her voice trembling but steady, her eyes filled with tears but unwavering. Miss Carter listened without interrupting, her expression filled with compassion and concern. When Emily was finished, Miss Carter leaned forward, her tone gentle but serious. "Thank you for sharing your story, Emily," she said. "You've been incredibly brave. I'm going to do everything I can to help you and your family." Emily nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. That evening, Emily came home to find Robert waiting for her in the living room. He was sitting in his usual chair, his expression cold and unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made Emily's blood run cold. "Where have you been?" he asked, his tone sharp and accusing. Emily hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't know what to say, but she knew she couldn't tell him the truth. "I was at school," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I had to stay late for a project." Robert's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I know what you've been up to." Emily felt a surge of panic, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Robert stood up, his presence looming over her like a storm cloud. "You think you can ruin me?" he demanded, his voice rising. "You think you can destroy everything I've worked for?" Emily didn't respond, her mind racing. She wanted to fight back, to stand up for herself, but she knew it was pointless. Robert held all the power, and she was just a pawn in his game. "You're going to stop this," Robert said, his tone final. "You're going to tell them it was all a lie, or there will be consequences." Emily felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, but it was quickly drowned out by a wave of helplessness. She wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything but sit there and endure his threats. But she knew she had to stay strong, for herself and for her mother. The next day, Miss Carter arrived at the house to speak with Linda. Emily watched from the stairs as her mother opened the door, her face pale and drawn. Linda hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside to let Miss Carter in. Emily couldn't hear the conversation that followed, but she could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. She wanted to go downstairs, to be there for her mother, but she knew it wasn't her place. Instead, she stayed where she was, her hands clenched into fists, her heart pounding in her chest. When Miss Carter finally left, Linda collapsed onto the couch, her face buried in her hands. Emily hesitated for a moment, then crept downstairs and sat down beside her. "Mom," she began, her voice trembling. Linda looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Emily," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for everything." Emily felt a surge of emotion, hot and sharp, but she forced herself to stay calm. "It's not your fault," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "We're going to get through this. Together." Linda nodded, but the guilt in her eyes was overwhelming. Emily reached out and took her mother's hand, her grip firm and reassuring. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The days following the social worker's visit were a whirlwind of change. Emily felt like she was living in a dream, her emotions swinging between relief and fear, hope and uncertainty. The weight of her secret was finally lifted, but the road ahead was still uncertain. She didn't know what would happen to her family, to Robert, or to herself, but for the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe. Ms. Carter had assured Emily that she and her mother would be safe, that steps were being taken to protect them. Robert had been ordered to leave the house temporarily, and a restraining order was in the works. Emily didn't know how long it would last, but she was grateful for reprieve. For the first time in years, the house felt quiet, peaceful, like a sanctuary rather than a prison. Linda, too, seemed to be coming out of her shell. The guilt that had consumed her for so long was still there, but it was no longer paralyzing. She began to take small steps toward rebuilding her relationship with Emily, starting with an apology that was long overdue. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Linda turned to Emily, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Emily," she said, her voice trembling. "I failed you in so many ways. I should have protected you. I should have been stronger." Emily looked at her mother, her heart aching at the sight of the woman who had once been her hero. She wanted to forgive her, to believe that things could change, but the wounds were still too fresh, the pain too deep. "Why didn't you stop him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you let him do this to us?" Linda flinched, as if the words had physically struck her. "I was scared," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I thought I had no choice. I thought if I just went along with it, things would get better. But I was wrong. I was so wrong." Emily didn't respond, her mind racing. She wanted to believe her mother, to believe that she had been a victim too, but the betrayal was still too raw. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Not yet." Linda nodded, her tears streaming down her face. "I understand," she whispered. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm going to do everything I can to make it up to you. I promise." Emily didn't know if her mother could keep that promise, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to heal. At school, things began to change as well. Mrs. Thompson had become a steadfast ally, checking in on Emily regularly and offering her support in any way she could. Emily's classmates, too, seemed to sense that something had changed. They didn't know the details, but they could see the difference in her. The way she held her head a little higher, the way she smiled a little more. Sarah, in particular, noticed a change. "You seem different," she said one afternoon as they sat together in the cafeteria. "In a good way. What's going on?" Emily hesitated, her mind racing. She wanted to tell Sarah the truth, to confide in her best friend, but the fear of judgment, of pity, kept her silent. "I'm just trying to move forward," she said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Sarah nodded, her expression filled with understanding. "Well, whatever it is, I'm here for you," she said softly. "You don't have to go through it alone." Emily felt a surge of gratitude, hot and sharp, but it was quickly followed by a wave of guilt. She wanted to believe that Sarah could help her, but the weight of her secret felt too heavy to share. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice trembling. "That means a lot." As the days passed, Emily began to find solace in her writing again. She had started a new journal, one that Robert couldn't take away from her, and she poured her heart out onto the pages. She wrote about the pain, the fear, the anger, but also about the hope, the resilience, the strength she had found within herself. It was cathartic, a way to make sense of the chaos in her life, a way to hold on to a shred of herself. One evening, as she sat at her desk writing, Linda knocked on her door. "Can I come in?" she asked, her tone hesitant. Emily nodded, setting her journal aside. "Sure." Linda stepped inside, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I just wanted to check on you, she said, her voice trembling. I know things have been hard. Emily nodded, her heart aching at the sight of her mother's guilt-ridden expression. They have, she admitted, but I'm trying. Linda hesitated for a moment, then sat down on the edge of Emily's bed. I'm proud of you, she said finally, her voice breaking. You've been so strong, so brave. I don't know how you did it. Emily felt a surge of emotion, hot and sharp, but she forced herself to stay calm. I didn't have a choice, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I had to be strong. For me, for us. Linda nodded, her tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry for everything. Emily didn't respond, her mind racing. She wanted to forgive her mother, to believe that things could change, but the wounds were still too fresh, the pain too deep. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said finally, her voice trembling. Not yet. Linda nodded, her tears streaming down her face. I understand, she whispered. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm going to do everything I can to make it up to you. I promise. Emily didn't know if her mother could keep that promise, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to heal. The legal process moved slowly, but it was moving. Ms. Carter had assured Emily that Robert would face consequences for his actions, that he wouldn't be able to hurt them anymore. Emily didn't know what those consequences would be, but she was grateful for the sense of justice, however small. One evening, as she sat in the living room with her mother, Emily felt a surge of emotion, hot and sharp. Do you think we'll ever be okay? She asked, her voice trembling. Linda hesitated, her expression filled with guilt and regret. I don't know, she admitted, but we're going to try. That's all we can do. Emily nodded, her heart aching at the sight of her mother's guilt-ridden expression. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Linda reached out and took Emily's hand, her grip firm and reassuring. I know, she said softly, but we're going to get through this. Together. Emily felt a surge of emotion, hot and sharp, but she forced herself to stay calm. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The months that followed were a journey of healing, one step at a time. Emily and Linda began to rebuild their lives, piece by piece, in the quiet aftermath of the storm. The house, once a place of fear and tension, slowly transformed into a home again. The walls seemed lighter, the air easier to breathe, as if the weight of Robert's presence had been lifted. Robert's legal case progressed, though slowly. He had been charged with multiple counts of abuse and coercion, and the restraining order ensured he could no longer contact Emily or Linda. Emily didn't attend the court hearings. Ms. Carter had advised against it, citing the emotional toll it might take, but she followed the case through updates from the social worker. Knowing that Robert was facing consequences for his actions gave her a sense of justice, however small. It wasn't enough to erase the pain, but it was a start. Emily's relationship with her mother remained complicated, but it was improving. Linda had started therapy, something she had resisted for years, and it was helping her confront the guilt and shame that had consumed her for so long. She began to open up to Emily in ways she never had before, sharing stories about her own childhood, her dreams, and her regrets. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of tension, of anger, of tears, but they were talking, and that was something. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Linda turned to Emily, her eyes filled with tears. I'm so proud of you, she said, her voice trembling. You've been so strong, so brave. I don't know how you did it. Emily looked at her mother, her heart aching at the sight of the woman who had once been her hero. I didn't have a choice, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I had to be strong. For me, for us. Linda nodded, her tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry for everything. Emily didn't respond immediately. She had thought about this moment countless times, wondering what she would say when her mother finally apologized. Now that it was here, the words felt both heavy and freeing. I forgive you, she said finally, her voice trembling. Not because what happened was okay, but because I don't want to carry the anger anymore. I want to move forward. Linda reached out and took Emily's hand, her grip firm and reassuring. Thank you, she whispered. I don't deserve it, but thank you. Emily nodded, her heart aching but lighter than it had been in years. Forgiveness wasn't easy, but it was a step toward healing, and that was enough for now. At school, Emily began to thrive, with the weight of her secret lifted. She found herself able to focus on her studies again. Her grades improved, and she even joined the school newspaper, where she discovered a passion for writing that went beyond her journal. Her articles were raw and honest, touching on topics like resilience, family, and the power of speaking out. She didn't write about her own experiences, not yet, but the act of writing itself was healing. Sarah noticed a change in Emily and was quick to celebrate it. You're like a whole new person, she said one afternoon as they walked home from school. I don't know what happened, but I'm glad you're doing better. Emily smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. I'm just trying to move forward, she said. It's not easy, but it's worth it. Sarah nodded, her expression filled with understanding. Well, whatever it is, I'm here for you, she said softly. You don't have to go through it alone. Emily felt a surge of gratitude, hot and sharp, but it was quickly followed by a wave of relief. For the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't alone. Therapy became a regular part of Emily's life, too. At first, she had been hesitant, unsure if talking to a stranger would help. But her therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Patel, quickly put her at ease. Together, they worked through the trauma, the anger, the fear, and the guilt. It wasn't easy. There were days when Emily left sessions feeling raw and exhausted. But it was helping. She was learning to forgive herself, to let go of the shame that had weighed her down for so long. One session, as they discussed her progress, Dr. Patel asked, "What do you want for your future, Emily?" Emily hesitated, her mind racing. She had spent so much time surviving, just trying to make it through each day, that she hadn't thought much about the future. But now, as she considered the question, she felt a glimmer of hope. I want to help people, she said finally, her voice steady. I want to write, to tell stories that matter, and I want to be happy. Dr. Patel smiled, her expression filled with warmth. Those are wonderful goals, she said, and I have no doubt you'll achieve them. Emily nodded, her heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time, she felt like the future was something to look forward to, not something to fear. The story of Emily's resilience began to inspire those around her, though she didn't realize at first. Her articles in the school newspaper resonated with her classmates, many of whom were dealing with their own struggles. She began to receive notes from peers thanking her for her honesty, for her courage. It was a strange feeling, knowing that her words could have such an impact, but it was also empowering. One day, Mrs. Thompson pulled her aside after class. I just want to say how proud I am of you, she said, her tone warm but serious. You've been through so much, but you've come out stronger. That's not something everyone can do. Emily felt a surge of emotion, hot and sharp, but she forced herself to stay calm. Thank you, she said, her voice trembling. I couldn't have done it without your help. Mrs. Thompson smiled, her expression filled with compassion. You're stronger than you think, Emily, she said softly. Never forget that. As the school year came to a close, Emily found herself reflecting on how far she had come. The pain was still there, a scar that would never fully fade, but it no longer defined her. She had found her voice, her strength, and her hope, and for the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. One evening, as she sat on the porch with her mother, watching the stars, Emily felt a sense of peace settle over her. I think we're going to be okay, she said, her voice steady. Linda looked at her, her eyes filled with tears. I think so, too, she whispered. We've been through so much, but we're still here. That has to mean something. Emily nodded, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to face it. Not as a victim, but as a survivor. And for the first time, she felt like the future was something to look forward to, not something to fear.